Welcome to In the Trenches, where entrepreneurs, artists, writers, designers, inventors, warriors, and leaders share their stories of doing the hard, creative work that impacts all of our lives. Let the journey inspire you to do something worthwhile, build something bold, and create your life's work. And now, your host, Tom Morkis.
Welcome back, everyone, to another broadcast of In the Trenches. I'm really excited to have on the call today Ben Green, who is the author of The Global Superstar, How Your Students Can Develop an Advantage Over Global Competition. And I think in a world that's becoming increasingly aware of global competition, it's been there for a while, but I think the awareness of it and the awareness of kind of the changes in the economy, especially when we think about like automation and machinery and stuff like that and outsourcing, I think what an important topic this is, not just for students, but for adults. But again, tying this, bringing this back to Ben and his book, the focal point of his book and kind of his platform is about teaching this to the younger generation. They're gonna grow up in this. So while maybe many of us have experienced this, again, how do kids who are growing up adapt to this type of environment? So I'm super excited to have Ben on the call today to discuss these matters. So Ben, thank you so much for being on the call with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on the call.
Absolutely. So before we dig into the book, tell me a little bit about your background and how this book came about.
Yep. So I was born and raised for the most part in South Carolina, and spent some time in college in Atlanta, Georgia. And a really good friend of mine was traveling around a lot for the 1996 Olympics to try to qualify. And he kept telling me about all these awesome places overseas he was visiting. So I really took a look into living overseas and working overseas. And that's what kind of got me started. And I subsequently lived in Japan for a total of 8 years. I lived in Spain for a year and lived in Brazil for a year as well. And then I also, when I returned to South Carolina, I did a lot of recruitment for the South Carolina Department of Commerce and got to see these amazing global companies that were actually coming to the United States, and also understanding what types of skill sets were necessary for people all around the country to actually get jobs at these companies. And so between my experience overseas, where I've seen and just faced a lot of competition, in first of all, my English teaching days, and then later on in my management and sales days, and then being back in the States and seeing the type of competition that is happening, and seeing people get displaced all the time from their jobs, and get displaced from their industries because of changes in technology and just the advancements that are being made. I put all that together and decided to write a book about it, and really help the younger generation and also some of their parents understand how they can compete better and compete more successfully, and also make sure that they didn't reinvent the wheel every time they're trying to figure out how to really take advantage of the opportunities that are out there.
Okay, awesome. So I guess my question is why a book? I guess that's the first question I'm going to start with. Why did you decide that this was a message that would be best served in book format?
Yes, so it's over the course of the last 15 years, I've probably given about 40 speeches to middle school students, high school students, and college students, and even some grad students and their parents. And I've written probably individually around 1,000 emails explaining like how I went to Japan, because people always want to know how I went to Japan, how I worked in Japan, how'd you get to Spain, and how'd you live in Brazil and work in Brazil. And so I've been able to have a lot of those individual and even those group interactions, but I felt like putting all that information, all that knowledge into a book where folks can access it from anywhere in the world, and they can access it over and over again, and really dig in deeply to some of the research that I provide, I felt was the biggest way to have an impact, and really help educate as many people as possible.
Okay, great. So now I'm curious about this. Like, why? Like, just to start from, I guess, the baseline here. Why is global competition even relevant? Why should we really even care about it? Especially if maybe the person is like a small business owner, somebody who's more tied to quote unquote a local economy, and or again students who aren't necessarily thinking in international perspective, or are maybe considering something like that too. Is global competition relevant?
Tom, that's a great question. So I guess on the good side, actually, it's relevant because there are a lot of international companies. There are a lot of foreign companies right in your backyard. So whether you're in Colorado or whether you're in Washington State, whether you're in South Carolina, Georgia, or in the Midwest, the United States is the number one country in the world to receive foreign direct investment. So there are a lot of opportunities for people to work at both foreign companies and domestic companies, and compete against other people in the world and really benefit from the global economy. So that's kind of the good news, and that's a reason why people should be aware of all these opportunities. On the flip side, you've had, I mean, it's very easy to see even in tech companies. Just yesterday I saw numbers on people being laid off, like 30,000 people being laid off from Intel and from HP and from all these other tech companies. And it happens in all types of industries around the country and around the world, where people thought they were in really stable jobs, or they thought they were in stable industries, or in stable businesses. And you either have other competitors come into the marketplace and disrupt their market, or you have technology come into the marketplace and really, upend the entire industry, and people find themselves out of a job. And sometimes they're able to, land on their feet because they have some good skills or they have good connections. But a lot of times you see people never return to the types of opportunities they had before and the type of income they had before. So this is, unless you're a millionaire,
Mm.
and unless your kids are already set up to become millionaires and be financially independent, when they get out of school, you really do have to think about and be aware of all the competition that's going to be facing you as you go forward.
Okay, cool. So I think the next question, and this leads into it pretty well, is understanding that it's important kind of across the board. How do we actually prepare? And specifically in the context of children, like and students, like, where whatever grade you want to start with probably through college. Um, how does somebody like that, who's maybe going through high school or going through college or maybe even younger, actually start to prepare in this context? What are the things to look at? How do they approach this?
That's a great question. So I can give you a personal example now, because I have a 6.5 month old, and it's been a challenge of mine. And so what we're doing with her right now, just to take it from the bottom, is we're talking to her a lot, and we're trying to read to her as much as possible and expose her to as many things as possible. And as she goes through elementary school and middle school, of course, we want her to have a good array of courses that she's going through, but we're also going to make sure that she's taking a foreign language or two. For her, I want her to take probably French, Spanish, and I would say either Japanese or Chinese, one of the Asian languages. We would pick French because she's going to be able to spend some time in Canada because my wife is Canadian. And then outside of that, I also want her to be, well-rounded. So I want her to be able to participate in some extracurricular activities, like playing sports, but also things like participating in the United Nations, and some of those, or maybe like the debate team, for example, because that will build a lot of her speaking skills and some of her presentation skills, which are really important. And it'll also build some of her persuasion and sales skills. So those are some of the things that I want her to develop as she goes from elementary school to middle school to high school. And then when she gets into college, I will encourage her, and probably even during latter part of high school, I would encourage her to take a look at, some of her interests, and then try to find internships that are based on those interests, and see if she can get experience with larger companies or smaller companies, or maybe even try her own entrepreneurial venture, and see if she can put it together and see how she can research it. And so there are a lot of different ways for people to really develop their skills over the course of years. But the baseline is that you need a baseline of education in terms of reading, arithmetic, etc. But then beyond that, you do need to develop, if you can, negotiation skills, some sales skills, some presentation skills. You need to be able to work collaboratively with other people and with other teams and diverse teams of people. And you need a really good mastery in English, written and reading, and spoken. And it's also good to have a really good mastery of basic math, so that you can do numbers in your head, and you can put together deals in your head. And so those are a lot of the different types of skills that I think will be necessary going forward to have an advantage over the other competition that's out there for these jobs and entrepreneurial opportunities.
I think the next question is, for me at least, I'm curious if there's like a particular set of, things we should focus on when it comes to like, again, student or child development, certain things that are the most applicable to make somebody competitive in the space. You mentioned language. I'm curious if you have like a construct or a certain number of things that we need to look at and implement from a young age to actually be competitive.
The most important thing is having a really good command of the English language. So whether it's spoken, written, or reading, things like reading contracts, for example, being able to have a really good command of English is the most important thing, I would say. Second to that are things like basic math skills, where you can do math in your head or come up with simple equations in your head to be able to think on the fly, and really think of deals while you're there at a customer site, or while you're negotiating something. Negotiation skills, whether you practice them or whether you read about them, or whether you learn them in a classroom, are also really helpful, because everyone everywhere is always negotiating everything. And then, in addition to that, sales skills or some sales experience, I think, is really important going forward, because the closer you can be to the money, if you will, in terms of either helping to produce revenue for your company, or for your obviously your entrepreneurial venture, or at least being able to understand how that revenue is produced, the better off you'll be as a I guess being a stable employee, and being an employee that's safe in the company. The other thing going forward that's been really important as the world becomes more diverse and more interconnected, being able to work with diverse sets of people, and being able to collaborate with people from all over and from all walks of life is really important. So those I would say are the most important skill sets to have.
So I'm curious, like in there's a certain, again in the U.S., I'm curious if taking the traditional route, then like whatever's kind of put in front of you, especially like in public schools or even in private, if you're just kind of following the the basic structure they have set up,
Hmm.
are we at an immediate disadvantage then? Just like because you mentioned some things that I don't think are necessarily really handled um, in high school, unfortunately, or necessarily in college.
So I would say that we're absolutely, on average, we're at a disadvantage in terms of what we may learn in the states from kind of the basics of language and math, for example, and science, for example. But where we're at an advantage in the United States is that we do, on average, teach more students to be creative, or be more innovative, or think more for themselves. That's something that they don't do that well in, let's say, India or in China, or when I was teaching in Japan. That we that was like something we were trying to teach them, trying to teach the students, but it's not traditionally taught like it is in the U.S. to do more creative writing or do more critical thinking on your own. So we're at a disadvantage on some of the basics. We're at an advantage in terms of some of the presentation skills and some of the creative writing, and maybe some of the critical thinking skills. But I think overall, Tommy, you're absolutely right. A lot of these topics aren't really covered in high school or in college, for that matter. And I, for example, did not take any like sales training, and have great sales experience until I got out of college. I didn't take my first negotiations course until I got into business school and got my MBA. And so I think for those two sets of skills, for example, and also for skills like learning to deal with people from different cultures, I didn't really do a lot of that either until I left college to go move over to Japan. And so it was a huge shock for me. So the more exposure you can get to those types of skill sets and those types of experiences, the better. And the earlier you can do that, the better.
Okay, great. You mentioned the creativity thing, and I think a lot of what I do is definitely that's important. I didn't choose a very technical path. I was just never necessarily very good at math or science, so I figured I'd just go towards my strong suit. I'm just curious, like with that said, kind of where the trajectory is in the economy and kind of advances in technology, you see a lot of outsourcing. You see a few things: outsourcing of more not necessarily the most technical tasks, like any really hard technical creative task. It's usually much harder to outsource that stuff. But certain things, like of course, like the proliferation of like outsourcing to the Philippines and India and stuff like that for maybe
Right.
lower skill type tasks and things like that. That's I think been pretty dramatic over the last 10 years from my perspective. Then we also
It
see
has.
automation and machine automation and stuff like that kind of replacing the more manual type labor. So with those two trends, I'm just curious, like, how does that fit in and then in the context of like, as we look at how we look at mathematics or how we look at creative tasks? I guess I'm looking at that. I'm thinking, well, that's kind of generic to say, well, we want to look at math or we want to encourage creativity. I'm just curious if there's anything where you can explain to me, like, or share with us how in the context of like the modern economy, like what are things that are there particular things, or particular skill sets, or particular things we should be aware of in that trajectory where that will be more applicable in the future than other things? Does that make sense? It's kind of a loaded question, but
Yeah. it, it's a loaded question, but it definitely makes sense.
okay.
Tom, it really makes sense. So, you actually you mentioned some of the examples. So you have the business process outsourcing to places like the Philippines, for example, and to India, for example. For years and years now, we've had outsourcing of call centers to places like the Philippines, places like India, places like Thailand, for example. And closer to home, more kind of domestic things. If you go into your grocery store, you have a lot less, cashiers at the grocery store now because that's automated. So AI, artificial intelligence, is really starting to come into play now. You have a lot less bank tellers than you used to have, because you and I don't have the time, for example, walk into the bank and make our deposits and withdrawals, et cetera. We go use the ATM, and that's, those ATMs have replaced, thousands of bank tellers around the country. And what really hit home to me, I went to a talk that Martin Ford had. He wrote, I believe it's called "The Rise of the Machines," and he showed a picture of a machine that can basically unload a truck. I think it's like I think 1 box per second, essentially, at a clip of 1 box per second, versus the fastest human that can do it at, I think, 1 box per every 6 seconds. That particular job was my first job in college 20 years ago. And so when I saw that, and I saw that a machine had replaced basically what I was trying to do 20 years ago, and that they haven't put these machines all around yet, what that really emphasizes, and what I want to have everyone really kind of hit home with, is that going forward, you're going to have to be very, very competitive at what you do, or you're going to potentially be crushed, or you're going to have basically the dregs of opportunities available to you if you're not competitive, and if you're not trying to really upgrade your skills and learn more and be at the top of your game, if you will. So, going forward, as I say in the book, there's a lot less room for people that are in the middle, and that aren't, that are just sort of so or average in their skills. Going forward, you're either going to be, headed towards the top, or you're going to be kind of at the bottom, if you will, because a lot of these tasks, a lot of these more manual tasks, or even kind of the higher level skill sets that are now being outsourced in the Philippines, or India, for example, those are not going to be available to higher wage workers in the United States or Europe. And there will come a point, actually, where even a lot of those jobs that are going to the Philippines or India, those may be taken over, or replaced by artificial intelligence as well. And so if you're not being competitive, and you're not being able to be in a place where you're a manager, or you're highly specialized and you have a lot of technical ability, you may be in a world of trouble as you try to really, find jobs that will pay you the type of wage you want to get paid.
Yeah, certainly. So, okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about the book itself and kind of getting it out there. What was your experience like going through the self-publishing route? And tell me a little bit about like kind of getting that book out there. Has it changed anything for you personally? What has been your experience with that process?
I was basically finished with the book probably about 3 or so years ago, and it took me a while to kind of to go through some of the traditional publishers, not, find a good fit. And then I found a couple of hybrid publishers that I thought might be a good fit, but they were not going to be able to give me the type of quick feedback that I wanted to get, and that I was able to get through Kindle and through Amazon and CreateSpace. And so I decided to go ahead and publish through the CreateSpace platform. And I would love to have, I guess a wider array of marketing choices, or, maybe having like one of the traditional publishers, put in $100,000 or something to help me market the book. But on the back end of that, it has been very good to be able to see, on a daily basis how my book is doing, and, who's buying it, where it's being bought, and how it's being distributed. So I've enjoyed the process, and I've enjoyed the process of starting to get it out there first locally, and regionally, and now I'm looking forward to getting it out there nationally to additional people that need to be able to hear the book and learn the concepts in the book.
And so you're kind of building a platform around this. Tell me a little bit about how this factors into kind of what you're doing now and what your goals are going forward.
I work as chief operating officer for an IT staffing firm here locally, and probably about the last 15 years of my history, I figured out that I had been just connecting people to opportunities for free, and I just kind of naturally had been giving people information about how to live in Japan or how to go live in Spain or Brazil, but giving people information about opportunities that were available here in South Carolina or, in other parts of the country. And so this book has really kind of rounded out my experience and rounded out and helped me figure out what I really do naturally anyways. And so as part of my platform, I want to be able to continue to get the message of the book out there, which is that people do need to be very competitive going forward, and they need to be strategic about how they build their skill sets going forward. And so this book has really helped me to create a platform in which I can go do that.
I love it, Ben. So do me a favor, tell me where people can find you, where they can check out the book, and dig into this topic a little bit more. And again, I'm going to highly encourage anybody with kids. I know I have the book and I don't have kids yet, but it's one of those things that I am very cognizant of and very aware that I definitely want to make sure that they have that competitive edge. So I encourage anybody who has kids or just interested in the topic of how do we educate students or just ourselves in the competitive environment to go check this book out. So where can people go find the book and find out more about you, Ben?
So, Tom, if they want to get access to the book, they can go to Amazon.com, and it's available there in print version and also in Kindle version.
Perfect. Okay, great. And then do you have a website or anything where people can go find out more about you and what you're working on?
Absolutely. So it's theglobalsuperstar.com, and they can find out more about my background. And of course, they have a link to the book as well. And I'll also be providing additional free resources going forward.
Perfect. I love it. Well, Ben, thank you so much for being on In the Trenches. It was great hearing your background, kind of what you've been doing in this book, which I think is so important. So thank you so much for being on In the Trenches.
Tom, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to In the Trenches. Your creative work doesn't stop here. Join the resistance, the small but growing army of entrepreneurs and artists putting a dent in the world at www.tommorkis.com. Never fight alone. Join the resistance.